The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help.
Biotech is making a comeback. That's the word from San Francisco during JP Morgan week anyway. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech, and I was there to hear it firsthand at what's inarguably the most target-rich environment in the world for a guy who likes talking to biotech leaders. I took full advantage. I racked up well over a dozen interviews with founders and CEOs and CBOs and CFOs, many of whom will feed our podcast lineup for weeks to come. These execs 201 brought facts, names, and numbers to back up their increasingly rosy market sentiments. Easing inflation, the promise of favorable interest rates, and December's flurry of M&A activity are just a few pieces of key evidence pointing to biotech's return. And speaking of returns, you know who else is making one? Everybody's favorite biotech CFO, Allan Shaw. He was at the top of my list to catch up with in San Francisco, and I'm thrilled that he made the time to make it happen. Let's give it a listen.
So Allan Shaw, it's been far too long since you've been on the show, and I'm thrilled that we get to do this one face to face. So welcome back.
Great to be back. Always great doing the show with you, and even better doing it in person now.
Yeah,
it's the first time we're not going through a screen.
I know it for sure. I'm thinking I need to start taking trips out to New York to record with you so we can do it in person. We can do it on the beach. We can do it while we're fishing, right?
I think with technology, we can really do it almost anywhere.
We can, yeah. So it's great to see you here. It's great to see you here in San Fran for JPM. When did you get into town?
I rolled in on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And I went immediately to a brunch reception.
Yeah, right. Hit the ground running. So we've been, I came in on Monday, but you've been going back to back, I'm sure, since you got here. What's the prevailing sentiment that you're picking up right now?
I think first of all, just touching on what you said, JP Morgan has been and continues to be an endurance sport. You really almost have to treat yourself like an athlete to get it through the week and take care of yourself and remember to hydrate.
Yeah.
With that said, the sentiment has been interesting and I'd say really consistent across the board. I'd say people are generally cautiously optimistic. I would say that everyone would generally agree that the wind isn't in our face as it has been, but it's not necessarily to our back either.
Yeah.
There's certainly reasons to be encouraged. I think a lot of people have pointed to, there was certainly the rally at the end of the year that turned the XBI, which was almost like 30% down, to break over as a positive, which was certainly encouraging. With that said, I haven't found anyone who's kind of stood up and waved their hand saying I was the one doing all the buying. I think there was a lot of short covering. So there's still, but people are definitely warming up. There's evidence that there's more buy-side engagement, as one banker put it to me the other day. The buy-side aperture is getting a little bit wider. Before people wouldn't even read your emails. Now they are reading the emails. So that's encouraging. And certainly the fact that there was over $30 billion of M&A in recent weeks has given people reason to be excited. Particularly since it does suggest that it certainly reinforces the thesis that big pharma has some real pipeline issues, that they're really going to have to solve these issues, given that their patent cliffs, they're about 3, 4, 5 years out. So there's obviously some aggressive buy-side actions. I think and that money gets recycled typically back into the market. So that should again be a positive indicator, and people have continued to look at that as a catalyst for the market to come back. I've heard some anecdotal information that they're expecting almost 30 IPOs this year. I think that's all going to be conditional on the success of the first couple that go out.
Yeah.
Some of the test IPOs, and if they trade well, I think you're going to see people pushing the IPOs out until they break it again.
That's what I was going to ask. Is 30? Do you think if a forecast of 30 is feasible? Is that a healthy number? Because constant, like it's just a regurgitation of the same conversation about how we were overpopulated with IPOs, and that contributed to the mess.
I think it is a healthy, if we get there. I'm not sure if we, get there, particularly in an election year. I think the other side of the coin, why people are cautious, why people don't think we're necessarily out of the woods, but are feeling better there is a prospect of interest rate cuts. And Fed certainly went out there in November and actually indicated there'd be a couple this year. That really, I think, in many respects, triggered the short coverage that we saw in the XBI. And I think it's a question of whether or not they materialize. We have low inflation's getting lower. It's not at the target levels yet. And employment seems to be pretty good. People are calling a soft landing. So I'm not sure if you need interest rates to stimulate the economy. The economy seems to be working pretty well. And when you look at interest rates on a historical level, we're right in the middle of the fairway. I'm not sure what necessarily the noise is, other than people have been spoiled by free money for over a decade. And I think they want their toys back.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I would also say, in terms of the M&A, the other side, where while people are highly encouraged by what's going on, the FTC continually seems to get in the way of things. They had blocked the Amgen Horizon trade for a long time, and it really seemed to be misguided. They had issues about the PBMs and drug pricing and how products get bundled. And rather than getting in the way of M&A, which is part of the natural life cycle of the industry, they should have been going after the PBMs if they didn't like the way that was working. So, it seemed to me really misguided in terms of how they were approaching it. And then they finished the year deciding to pick another battle that made no sense, which caused Sanofi to back away from a licensing deal, of all things.
Yeah.
So, they've got to kind of get their policy on order. And I'm not sure with the election coming up, this is the year to expect significant rational behavior from these folks.
Yeah. You mentioned, the impact of the election year. Explain that for me. Like what sort of an impact should we expect or might we expect?
Yeah, fair enough. If people can recall back to the 2017, when during the election that Hillary ran against Trump. I forget whatever year it was now.
Yeah.
But if you recall that biotech was having a pretty good run until Hillary hit the Twitter with negative biopharmaceutical sentiment in terms of policy and other things. And it really put a chill in the sector. And we really traded off for the second half of 2015 going into 2016. I know I did launch an IPO during that period of time, and I'll never forget that the front page of the Wall Street Journal the day we were seeking board approval was IPO market closed. Yeah. My son asked me, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "You don't understand the damn about to happen. This is the narrative."
Yeah.
But we got it done. But it's that political rhetoric. It's the platitudes, the tweets. Pharma, biotech seems to be the politician's favorite whipping boy, which is kind of ironic when you think about the contribution and impact on humanity that the industry has provided. And arguably, it's more profound than what all the foreign aid that we send and all the military stuff that we send. But nonetheless, and the negative sentiment that we get, we do bring it on when we keep increasing prices on products that have been around for years, annually or semi-annually by 3-4%. We're just poking the bear in the eye.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There was a panel yesterday. There was a panel yesterday at the end of the day on that sentiment. The fact that biotech and pharma are on par in the public purview
with tobacco and oil and gas, right? Like it's so interesting to me. During COVID, when COVID happened, it was like there was this spike in sentiment, a positive spike, and then very quickly that evaporated. How do you that's a general question, but what are your thoughts on how an industry sustains, at least a semi-positive public perception?
Yeah, it's certainly easier said than done. I think we need to be seen more as advocates for the patient population, as opposed to people that seem to be taking advantage of the patient population. And when you're just raising prices, and then and it's all part of the rebate cycle and how you get yourself positioned, the patients are losing in that situation. And then, the PBMs and the industry, bringing it on themselves. I think, as we start to look at patient engagement, holistic solutions, I could see the industry being helpful in that level of engagement. I think there's efforts now to kind of cut out the middleman. And I think the cutting out the middleman, like the PBMs, and going direct is going to allow us to kind of reallocate things the right way, as opposed to paying the middleman for very little value added at the end of the day, other than it's been the way we conduct business, like night follows day. I would say, if you take a step back, a much more holistic look, the healthcare spend in the United States is highest in the world. Yet, our outcomes and mortality rates are some of the lowest ones. So effectively, we're paying more for less.
Right.
And, I think, we should be advocates for trying to make the appropriate changes in the system, because what we got right now isn't sustainable. It's really broken, and what industry, and I think that's going to result in us taking much more of a risk-based approach to the products that we sell. And as some of these other products become almost like services, when you're looking at gene editing and you're looking at cell therapy, you're providing services, you're providing solutions now, and you're providing outcomes. And I think that'll be helpful in changing the narrative. But, and I think probably highlighting and figuring out how we can educate people on the contributions, on the lives that we're saving, and the impact on people. And there's a lot of beautiful stories out there.
Yeah.
They don't seem to be out there. People aren't really aware of that. So, we probably need a new publicist, but I think actions speak louder than words.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about our conversation before we started recording, and I was obviously, I want to spend some time talking about your perception of the markets and the industry, but with the headwind, allegedly going away, to your point, maybe not at our back quite yet. I was wondering, what are you and I going to commiserate about if things get better? But now you're giving me plenty of fodder for that.
Oh, I think, it's, I don't think everybody's a winner or a loser. I don't think this is necessarily, you're flicking a switch and things are going to go back to the roaring 2020s. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily anticipate that. I think people are going to be a lot more discerning. I think we still have a lot of companies that are kind of walking zombies out there. And there's going to have to be, a come to Jesus moment for them in terms of whether or not they'll be able to continue to execute. I think people have to still, I guess, take their medicine. And those who take their medicine, who skinny down and focus on what they need to focus on, will get to the other end. I think this is a time to be a bit scrappy. So, and as things change, I think it's not going to go back. I don't anticipate it going back to where it was. So it's going to be a lot more emphasis on management teams. Mm-hmm. I think when, we chatted during good times too. I remember talking about the boy bands of biotech,
right?
As we were marching, putting management teams together around newly formed companies and pushing them out the door. So, I think it's going to kind of get back to more fundamentals. I think that people are going to put more fundamental emphasis on the quality of the management team. I think we've seen, and I've said this before, and I'll emphasize it again, that, given the choice between a superior asset and a middling management team, or a middling asset and a superior management team, I would always take the later. Because they'll know how to extract value. As a friend of mine put it, we were talking about this on breakfast today. He says, these assets don't develop by themselves.
Right.
And you need to be able to navigate the myriad of different aspects. You need to navigate the science and the proof of concept. You need to be able to navigate the manufacturing. You need to manage the accrual rates of clinical trials. I've observed a fundamental difference in the way people execute on these things. And I've seen them generate good results, and I've seen them not generate as good of results. So I think it's going to really put more of an emphasis on execution. And I think for good science, for good teams, if you can execute, there'll be an opportunity there. As we've said before, in God we trust, and data believe, and it's just going to be really getting back to basics.
Yeah. Do you see, like, if you think about the overpopulation of biotechs pre, bubble popping or whatever you want to call it, you talk a lot about, jockeys and executing on management. Do you see like the pool of talent as being in a healthy place right now, or an improved place right now, given that so many execs and founders have been battle tested? Or what's your take on that? Like, do you think it's a good field of jockeys right now?
I think we were stretched, I mean, and maybe stressed in terms of how we were populating these seats.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody told me when I was younger, if you can't jump over the bar, you lower it. And I think the bars were lowered in many cases. And I think that also speaks to some of the things we've spoken about in past episodes about the productivity. There was a lot more clinical failures. And I think people were doing things because they could. And the flow of money wasn't restrictive. So my partner, or worry about getting it validated, I'll just do it all.
Yeah.
And I think that the inexperience of people thinking that, a high tide was going to keep all the boats high, people got caught out. So I actually see this as a period where companies who have the wherewithal, there's an opportunity for them to upgrade their management teams and their organization. Because I think there's still a bit of a mismatch. I think you still got, a ridiculous number of companies out there that are underwater. And as I understand it, additionally, there's at least 130 companies that are trying to go public. So even if the 30 of those that we talked about get out, what about the other folks? And as I think you touched on before, someone touched on that, now they're making reverse mergers a little bit more restrictive as well. Well, I don't think it'll be a big as big an issue, but it's just not helpful. And, I think the reverse mergers was one way to kind of help clean up the system. Mm-hmm. The way I saw it is you could do 30 IPOs, but if you got over 100, 150 companies that are broken, you should be able to match those up with the companies who want to go public and try to take a little pressure out of the system.
Yeah.
But what I've also heard is because of this new discerning environment, that there's a number of companies that have been funded by the fundamental specialist VCs who are those investors are not re-upping, and they're going to let them kind of just hit the wall or take a very soft landing.
Yeah.
So I think that speaks to the fact that that the bar needs to get raised, whether it's management teams, whether it's the science or the companies. I think investors have lost a lot of money over the last several years. And I think they're certainly very focused on self-preservation. And on that, speaking about the financing environment, I think a lot of the deals that have been getting done, a lot of these data pipes speaks to that. A lot of companies are given a lot of upside. Usually the play would be you'd announce the data and do a deal, and the stock would re-rate itself. Because of the market dynamics, people are now entering into these data pipes where you bring the investors over the wall. They get to kick the tires, see everything before anyone else. You negotiate a deal. The deal is going to not necessarily provide the same level of valuation re-rating, but you've now got the money to do what else you need to do. You've got some validating investors in your cap table. And that seems to be the business right now. I think as something to watch as we cautiously approach optimistically the new year is to see whether or not those deals will be as prevalent, or whether or not people can get back to doing follow-on offerings without having to transact that way.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask you a question about that. Like the deal structure, starting with a more scrupulous, I guess, investor base, right? More discerning, as we've been saying. And then the way that deals have been structured as investors have become more discerning. When cycles like this happen, what sticks? Like what carries on? Like tranche deals, for instance. Like one, I want to get your perspective on like what's been difficult in terms of the way the deals are being done now. But I'm also curious about like as cycles like this happen, do terms that happen in down cycles tend to carry on, or do they go away when things get better again?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, it's really about supply and demand.
Yeah.
And when you have a lack of supply, it's really a buyer's market, and they can drive the terms. And I think looking at flow of funds will be really important. The return of the M&A dollars, fund flow will dictate, the demand side of the equation, and that keeps people honest. When you do any sort of marketed deal, you want demand. If you can drive demand, you can drive the terms. If you don't have demand, the terms will be driven to you.
Yeah.
So I think the terms right now are, again, I think more in the side of the investor, but it's I would say fair, but nothing's guaranteed in life. So that's the risk. So what I've been seeing on these deals is that, you generally get funded to an initial inflection point, and then you'll put warrants on it that'll be tied to a success event. Mm-hmm. So once you have the data, the warrant can be exercised, and the data should drive appreciation, which will cause that. So what people are doing, rather than writing a check for, say, $60 million, and this is going to get you through all your clinical trials, they might write you a check for 20, that gets you to a study. If that study's good, the warrant can exercise and can take it to the next level. So if you execute, your trials are funded. Mm-hmm. You don't execute, you're going to have other problems as well.
Yeah.
So that's the way that people are tranching it, and it makes intuitive sense, but it kind of keeps people on a short leash.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to get back to, we talked about some of the, I guess, overarching kind of global indicators like inflation and interest rates. What other indicators are you seeing that point either way? Like, we'll start with positive indicators. What indicators haven't we discussed that you think are pointing towards improvement?
I guess I would build off of the things that we've discussed. That the cut in interest rates is certainly good. I think the question is that a head fake or not? So, Jamie Dimon, for instance, when he was speaking at the conference, he declared that he didn't believe in the soft landing. He saw too many inflationary issues out there that will keep the Fed rates higher for longer. And then there's other people saying we're in an election year. They're going to cut the rates whether they're needed or not, which is certainly disappointing from an idealistic perspective of the Fed's independence. But so I think the macro is going to be really important. Interest rates are going to have a profound impact. I think the M&A activities are important. And if the FTC continues to do what it does, it's going to be a Debbie Downer. But I think that dynamic is helpful. I think there was an M&A deal recently that should give investors some encouragement to perhaps take a little bit more risk. And that's important about taking risk, and that really correlates to the interest rates. The higher the rates, the less risk. So, for instance, the Harpoon transaction the other day that went off for $23 a share, the company was hurting only as recently as maybe 3 months ago, and they did a recapitalization at about $5 a share. So those investors that invested at $5, they got a fourfold return in 3 months. Mm-hmm. So I think positive returns on transactions like that are going to cause people to take a more serious look at other opportunities. Because when you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, there's opportunities to really create value relatively easily. So really, flow of funds, interest rates, M&A. From my vantage point, those are really the most fundamental. That's what I'm looking at. Yeah. That's going to drive other investors back into the space. I think there is generally more sentiment that the biotech sector is kind of hit. People are calling it the low has been hit. Still think it's a bit of a stock pickers club. But generally, the sentiment is good, and I hope it becomes more self-fulfilling as the year goes on.
Yeah. What do you election cycle being sort of a wild card? You mentioned its influence potentially negative. What else are you concerned about?
Drug pricing. I think the drug pricing discussions are going to just, it's the poster child for all the rhetoric, mm-hmm. and I think that drives a lot of the headwinds. We shouldn't be public enemy number one, as we said earlier. It's unfortunate for all the good that we do. But we're easy targets. Even when you look at our financial statements, the profitability of these companies are some of the most profitable in the world. So as long as those conditions prevail, I think we remain an easy target. And I think we just got to brace ourselves for that. It's noise. Most of this is just noise. So, it'll arguably be for people who understand that it's more noise than anything. It's really political theater. I think it actually represents a good opportunity, because as the fundamentals are improving, it actually represents a really good entry point. And I think people are starting to realize that there's an improvement in that. I guess a subtle metric that I would use to track the progress is, talking to investor relations firms. One of the questions I've been asking people is the robust nature of their meetings. Are they getting a lot of meetings for their clients in terms of small caps, large caps? And I'd say it varies. The small caps are not feeling as much love. Mm-hmm. And that's going to make it harder. So, I'd say valuation re-rating will be something to look at too, whether or not people recognize, if a Harpoon was trading at 5 and it trades for 23, what other arbitrage opportunities are there?
Yeah. Yeah. What about scientific and technical advances? Like, it's been a lot of conversations about all the great science and great programs that have been shelved for lack of resources. As things come back, does that, like a revisiting of some of the new science and technology in the space, does that contribute to?
Oh, totally. That the different therapeutic areas and modalities are kind of like platform shoes. They go in and out of fashion. Today's fashion is kind of almost back to the future, between radio pharma and ADCs, mm-hmm. Kind of back to chemotherapy and radiation. Yeah. So in a new form. I would say with the recent acquisitions of Cerevel and Karuna, CNS is an area that people are starting to really pay renewed focus. Certainly BMS is certainly getting very aggressive there as a real focus area. GLP, the whole obesity market has captivated the industry last year. I think it'll continue to dominate a lot of noise. there's certainly a lot of people emulating that, and then looking at oral formulations. And there's different approaches. I almost cynically look at that whole hype and build out the whole GLP trade. It's kind of almost like similar to buying or selling Tesla. In a new market, there's going to be other electric car vehicles too, and But I think in terms of the GLP, I think what will be interesting too is because there's incredible side effects that people haven't taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
When you lose that weight, you're also losing muscle mass.
Yeah.
And then generally when you rebound and you put the weight back,
Yeah.
you're only putting back fat.
And bone, you lose bone density too. I understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that's still got to work its way through. I think there's better mousetraps to be had. I thought one anecdote that somebody put out there was they think it's going to become a vacation drug. People are going to take it a couple of months before they go away.
A vanity drug. Yeah.
Absolutely. And question if it, so I think some of the expectations may be a little bit long on that. I just don't think the durations and the penetration is going to necessarily last. But it'll be interesting to see how durable that is. I think a lot of buzz that people are looking at is AI.
Everybody wants to talk to me about AI.
Oh, everywhere.
Everybody. Yeah.
And it was funny. I was listening to a panel when I was out here. I said, given everyone's talking about it, I better get smart on this quick. Mm-hmm. And I thought one of the interesting observations I got on one of the panels that I listened to is that, since so much of the data is in the public domain, one of the issues that we have that seems to be getting not glossed over, it's quietly not being addressed, is the fact that the negative data is not so pervasive in the public domain. People don't generally publish their negative data as much as they publish their positive data. So, so the algorithms and the data that we're basing a lot of these things on are arguably biased to being positive, and we're not learning from the lessons from our failures, which is probably even more important.
Right.
So, the people on the panel acknowledge that that's a real issue.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's necessarily a great solution yet, figuring out how you're going to get people to collaborate and share all of that, and how inclusive is it, and is it representational? So that to me suggests that while we're making great advances, there's still a few more things to sort out, but it's definitely going to be impactful.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think came out of what I was hearing was that, while it's the buzz, a lot of people have been doing a lot of machine learning and a lot of, in terms of discovery efforts for over a decade.
Yeah.
So, it's not necessarily new. It's just, again, maybe it's 2.0 or 3.0 of what we're doing. And we're getting better in terms of data management, but it really seems to be like data management. Once you have data management, I think that will unlock. But right now, the emphasis is on data.
Are you hearing anything about the impact that AI and ML might have moving forward, like beyond discovery and design? That's where like the use cases are right now, accelerated discovery, aiding in molecular design. But when I think like in terms of a biotech moving, you get into translational and you start moving towards the clinic, that's when things start to get a little muddy, like what AI and machine learning might contribute to what effectively is the most daunting, the do or die moment, right? The clinical trials. Are you hearing anything on that?
Yeah, I guess I haven't paid as much attention to it yet, but my instinct is that it should be able to positively impact patient accruals. Mm-hmm. Access to, medical records. You should, if you're running an AML study, you should be able to identify everybody who has AML.
Yeah.
And, you should be able to figure out better ways to recruit patients. Mm-hmm. I certainly think that, in terms of some of the administrative aspects of clinical trials, it could probably improve efficiency, remove some of the human bottlenecks associated with it. I could see it, as you're processing amendments and the protocols that can make things much more efficient. Again, I think you need the broader infrastructure to make that work. But I think it can have a profound impact all the way into the medical services side,
Yeah.
doctors' assistants, I think that's an area where you can probably free things up.
Yeah.
You just talk to R2D2 and get your script.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's an important conversation. I was talking to a guy recently about AI and ML, and he was positing that we don't, we're not in a molecular drought. Like there's plenty to work with where AI and ML have had an impact. Now it's time to figure out how to address the real issues. So I think it's an important conversation to have and an important technology to watch as it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it can also really help in terms of helping us define what is the economic value of drugs, right? That to me is on the fundamental assessment is, hospitalization costs, the cost of treating them, retreating them, periods of time of how long you can avoid being rehospitalized. I think a lot of these we can really take advantage of some real world data and quantify it to better understand what the value of the drugs are, how they should be priced, and structure it, whether it should be risk sharing and how much money goes back into the system. Right now, people don't see this as system savings. They're saving money for their P&L or their P&L. So there's not a holistic approach. But I think with better information, it can steer more informed decisions and getting policymakers to get to the right places.
Yeah. Yeah. What haven't I asked you that I should have? What haven't we hit on here?
Let me think.
No, yeah, we can. I can stitch this back together. We've been bumping around, so I don't want to beat any ponies that are already dead.
One of your questions. We can probably talk about the conference. How's this compared to other years?
Yeah, yeah.
And we can talk about the conference itself. There's a lot of people talking about it being moved. That.
How many years have you attended this conference?
I've been coming here for well over a decade, and I made my first trip in 2023, and then I came back about 10 years later.
2003.
2003.
2003.
And then I came back about 10 years later, and this is 12, 13 years.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then there was that hiatus, right, during COVID. I don't have a point of reference because last year was my first JPM. Last year was the first time I came, so I didn't have a point of reference like what the conference looked like prior to COVID or in the heydays. What's your assessment? Like if you take into account what you're seeing here today, this year.
The conference has evolved. I like the kid that when I come to JP Morgan, I'm coming to hang out with 40,000 of my closest friends.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we got to 40,000 this year. The head count number seems to be a bit lighter. I thought last year we had a little bit of pent up demand given the hiatus we had due to COVID. I think people wanted to get out and about. And I did find it to be lighter than prior years. But it still felt like there was a little bit more intensity. This year, it seemed to be less flow of people. I can tell you that when I was at the JP Morgan conference, the St. Francis, other than when Jamie Dimon was talking, it was very easy to move around in the building. That was the only time I thought fire would be a problem.
Yeah.
I would say talking to the folks who run the biotech showcase, they indicated that the numbers were a little bit lighter than prior years. But, when I heard from JP Morgan that they cut their invitations down by about 20%, those guys were doing much better. I would say their numbers were almost flat, which suggests that, there's still demand. People are still coming. I would say that there is generally a distinction between the companies that present at the JP Morgan conference versus the Biotech Showcase. I think the Biotech Showcase does something that's really great. It provides access for companies to investors that would otherwise not have access to investors. So, it shows that there's still you'd have to drill into it deeper. But I would say on a high level, it sounds like there's a lot of companies that are trying to still engage with investors, and that's outpacing maybe the headcount decline that we've seen here at the conference.
Yeah, it's like a cottage industry, right? Like there's a village of events, of receptions, of meetings, of venues. Has that grown in your in your JPM tenure? Have you seen sort of that the outward growth into all these different events, or has it been like that from the start?
I would say that it's definitely been that way for a long time.
Yeah.
I would say that, we got into that, what I would say the 2020 conference, was really the inflection point. And, it was just nuts, the number of different receptions, the number of different events, the number of different people. I found that I could walk down any street and I found like my life would pass me by, the different people that you'd run into. And at that point, they were charging me for everything. I expected someone to come up to me on the sidewalk to start charging me for standing there. Mm-hmm. I would say that this year there's been a little less interaction like that, but if you stand in place near the St. Francis, you're going to see a lot of people in a short period of time. I think that the service providers see this as a real opportunity for them to kind of try to build their book of business for the year.
Yeah.
I would say that what I like about JP Morgan is it's a very efficient way to be able to reconnect with a lot of people in a very short period of time, as well as also expand your circle of friends as well. So I've found it over the years to be a great place for doing business, whether it's your own personal business development, whether or not you're looking to raise money and connect to investors, or you're trying to do strategic transactions. But because the nature of the interaction is so superficial, I mean, it's really like speed dating. Mm-hmm. It's really, JP Morgan's really all about the follow-up. And the success of your year, the success of your time here is really about the follow-up in terms of, it's great you've renewed relationships, but then, you want to continue to build on them and stay relevant. What the beauty is, too, is that you could see somebody that you haven't seen in a half a decade. Yeah. And it's like yesterday. And I think it's a reminder to everybody that, sometimes you think it's been too long. Who's going to remember me? People remember, and I encourage everybody to reach out to people and stay in touch. It's a cold, harsh world that we live in, and being able to expand those circle of friends makes it a warmer place.
Yeah. Do you see like the significance of the what goes on at the Westin St. Francis, like the JP Morgan kind of nucleus? Do you see its significance? I don't want to say dwindling, but I've had many conversations with biotech execs this week who haven't set foot in the Westin St. Francis and maybe aren't even here for the, any of the other ancillary events. They're here for meetings that they've set up, they're doing things on the periphery. So does that significance kind of wane at all, or is there still a great mighty weight to sort of ground zero there?
It's a fantastic question, and certainly you're gonna get a lot of different perspectives on it. From my 2 cents, JP Morgan has become nomenclature for the world's largest healthcare conference in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. But with that said, it's anchored by the JP Morgan conference. Yeah. And there's been a lot of people talking about their disdain for the city of San Francisco, and would love to bring it to a place where you weren't jammed or poked in the eye for all the costs, where you didn't have to deal with a lot of the other social issues that are prevalent here. Yeah. But I don't think that's going to work. I mean, I think it would be great, if you brought this to say Orlando, if you brought this to Las Vegas. But with that said, I think you're actually going to be then marginalizing or commoditizing the JP Morgan conference if you did that, because I think having it in the St. Francis, they control the narrative. There's been a lot of history there. This goes back to H&Q back in the 90s. And then, people still refer to it as the So there's a lot of history there. And I think, for them to be able to continue to control the narrative as they do around the event, Jamie Dimon's claiming that he's responsible for all the people that come to San Francisco. I think they're going to keep it here because I think it allows them to, like I said, control the narrative of the event. It's their event, even if it has become nomenclature.
Well, good deal. Anything else you wanted to cover?
I guess the only thing I would add is that, after having been in the in a what it seemed to be a war or a firefight or a storm for a couple of years, I think it's really, really encouraging to see that there's now positive, cautious optimism out there to look forward to. I don't think we're ready to bang the drums yet, but I am encouraged. But I think there's a lot of things that we as an industry have to navigate. And but I think it's back to fundamentals.
Yeah. I mean, we don't want the drums to bang too hard, right?
I think they were banging too loud before. I think we got to learn from what happened. Yeah. But I think there's great. I mean, at the conference, I was looking at the next wave of companies in the private sector. And some of the science that's coming out, that's around the corner, is really, really, really interesting. It's really, really, really responsive. And I think the other thing is the industry has pivoted a little bit. There seems to be much more of an emphasis on an evolution more to chronic disease, heart disease. And I think that's really, really important because when you've looked at all the preponderance of what's been approved over the last decade, it's very concentrated in orphan disease. It's very concentrated in oncology, and I've written things in the past that said that there was a lot of economic reasons for why that capital allocation was occurring, but it's nice to see, given the broad populations, that these large modalities or indications are now being addressed, and I think that that's going to really make a positive impact. But it also speaks to the fact that people are looking for bigger markets to invest in now. That seems to be the issue, and I think that speaks to the pharma pipeline. And I say the risk on all of that when people are investing in later stage products or larger indications like that is the hard part now is how do you continue innovation? And right now, the emphasis on data is so important, and it's kind of a chicken and the egg. How do you start something without the data? And so one of the questions I have going into the year is, how well will we proceed in the near term with funding innovation, given that we kind of head pulled back so much as an industry?
Right.
I think the good news is Goldman Sachs just opened up their first fund, I think a $600 million fund. There's been a number of other continued VC financings. I think OrbiMed opened up a couple of funds. So, that bodes well to innovation, but the innovation is going to be driven from the specialists. I think it's going to be hard for people who are trying to do it outside of the specialist funds, just given the way the dynamics. And I would point to, Peter Kaczynski recently wrote another piece talking about, his view that, the haves and have-nots, and if you look at the success of those funds, and it certainly caused some spirited discussion among folks. It was certainly provocative, to say the least.
Yeah. Real quick, we talked about a number of indications and markets. We talked about obesity. We talked about oncology. We talked about CNS. I'm curious, related to CNS, what your take is on the anti-aging space.
I think this, as we see the demographic shifting, it's certainly been an area of focus. I've always found it very hard to describe what is anti-aging. It's very subjective. Yeah. You can attribute a lot of products already on the market that could be arguably anti-aging. I think it's a great market opportunity because, you go back to vanity, and I think longevity is an extension of all of that. I think it kind of almost feeds into what we're talking about before about patient engagement. Because I think, if you're talking about anti-aging, you've got to do a number of different things. I don't think there's a single bullet. I know a whole bunch of people, particularly billionaires over 60, that like to take metformin because there's been a lot of aging and life analysis on metformin. But I do think, if you exercise, you eat right, and, and there is work being done there. I think it's a bit early. I'm not sure if it's something I would personally get involved with. But again, if there's an articulate plan, if there's really endpoints that you can look at, and I think it's an interesting area, and I think a lot of people are chasing it.
Yeah, very good. Well, I appreciate the time, Allan. It's been a pleasure. Here's to 24. Here's to having you back on the show more often. We got off of our cadence, so we got to get that back in the cycle. We'll be in touch on that to get the next one scheduled, but I really appreciate always getting your insight. So does our audience. So thank you.
My pleasure. It's always great to hang with you. And I love doing the program with you, and to be continued.
I'm Matt Pillar, and you just listened to the Business of Biotech, the weekly podcast dedicated to the builders of biotech. We drop a new episode with a new exec every Monday morning, and I'd like you to join our community of subscribers at bioprocessonline.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to our never spammy, always insightful monthly newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. If you have feedback or topic and guest suggestions, hit me up on LinkedIn and let's chat. And as always, thanks for listening.